Well, it sure sounds like you're a very well-rounded guy. And thanks for your service to our country, too.
Well, thank you, Vic. I appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. Tom, what kind of interest did you have in werewolves and things like that go bump in the night when you were growing up?
Frankly, not too much. Yes, I saw the occasional horror movie, but I was more interested in sports and girls, I guess, more so than supernatural or paranormal.
I can understand that. When you had your encounter, you were an active duty Marine. Please tell us what you did in the Marines.
Well, my MOS, or also known as the Military Occupational Specialty, was 2841, which was a radio repair technician. I went through a year of intensive schooling at the Marine Corps base in 29 Palms, California to learn that job. The MOS required I have a top secret clearance because I did work with cryptology gear and things of that nature.
I see. Before you had your encounter, had you heard of any other Marines having an encounter with what might have been a dogman?
No, I did not.
Well, that's not all that surprising. Have you heard about any Marines having an encounter after you had yours?
Well, actually, since the advent of the internet, probably maybe going back 10 years, I had looked up incidents in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, which was where my dogman encounter occurred, and there was some mention of Sasquatch sightings there. So I don't recall anything about an actual dogman sighting, but there is supposedly Sasquatch sightings in that county, which is Onslow County, and perhaps even on the Marine Corps base.
Yeah, I think I've heard about other dogman encounters happening in that area too. At the time of your encounter, you had a top secret clearance like you just mentioned. How did that complicate matters for you after you saw what you saw that night?
Well, even though I was close to the expiration of my active duty, it was probably 4 months before I was actually scheduled to be discharged. It's not something you would tell your commanding officer or any superiors because certainly you don't want to have them pull your clearance. And I had also thought about perhaps going back into the military as an officer after I completed my 4-year degree. So I didn't want to have any black marks on my record book, let's put it that way.
If you had reported what you saw to your commanding officer, what do you think would have happened?
They probably would have sent me for some type of psychiatric evaluation.
And that pretty much would have ended your military career, wouldn't it?
Well, I probably would have gotten out as a normal discharge because, as I indicated, I was close to getting out anyway, but I don't think it would have assisted me or helped me in any way of trying to go back in as an officer, in some kind of commissioning program. So some things are better left unsaid, Vic.
Especially something like that. Did you have any standing orders on how to handle an encounter with an unknown entity like that?
Well, not so much an unknown entity, but you do have your general orders when you're on guard duty, and by Marine Corps standards or protocol, I probably should have mentioned it or reported it. But again, I think discretion is the better part of valor, and myself and the other individual that was with me decided it was probably better just to keep quiet about it.
Well, like I told you before, I really don't blame you for doing that. Did you refuse any assignments after having that encounter?
No, I did not.
Yeah, I can't see that going over all that well. I don't care what your reason is.
Well, you never want to refuse a direct order because that can create some real issues for your career as well as any future endeavors you may wish to have in the military.
Yeah, I didn't think that would be a wise move. Had you heard the term dogman before you had that encounter?
No, actually, Vic, the first time I heard that term was listening to your show, probably going back about 4 or 5 months.
If it was that recent when you heard the term for the first time, what can you tell us about the feeling you had once you started finding out about all these other people who had the same kind of experience that you had years ago?
Well, here's the thing. The closest thing that I could describe to what I saw would be a Sasquatch. And even though it didn't look like the classic Sasquatch as far as the head, but I kind of feel vindicated because now, listening to these other descriptions, it certainly appears that what I saw was a dogman and not a Sasquatch, and certainly not a large bear.
Yeah, sure doesn't sound like it was a Sasquatch or a bear. You talked about finding out about the term dogman just about 5-6 months ago. How much research did you put into dogman after you had that experience?
Well, I've listened to a number of your shows and a couple other ones that pale in comparison to Dogman Encounters, but there's not a whole lot of information out there. It's certainly not as much information as one could glean from researching Sasquatch or Bigfoot. But there's something that at least made me realize that what I saw was actually of the dogman variety and not a Sasquatch.
Yeah, from the way you describe it, it sure sounds that way to me. Before you tell us about your encounter, Tom, please tell us about the area where you had that encounter.
Well, it was the wooded portion of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. It's old-growth pine forest in the particular area where I was. We're talking trees that are 100 feet tall, possibly. Very thick growth, very thick trunks, a lot of brush and undergrowth. A canopy so that in the daytime you're not getting a lot of sunlight on the forest floor, and at night you're certainly not getting any moonlight. So it would be the perfect place for something like a dogman to hide and not be detected.
People ask and wonder why dogmen and Sasquatch seem to like to hang out on bases like that, but if you think about it, you're talking about huge areas of land where, for the most part, people just don't go. You're not allowed to hunt there. It's a perfect place for them.
Well, of course, and other than being out there for exercises or maneuvers, there's really no one wandering around there, like you said. So, of course, there's no campers, there's no hunters, no fishermen, no hikers. So it would be a perfect place for them to exist without being detected.
Oh, sure. All right, Tom, please tell us about your encounter. Give us every last detail that comes to mind.
In the spring of 1979, I was stationed at the Marine Corps base at Camp Lejeune, located in the eastern section of North Carolina. I was a sergeant assigned to a Headquarters Battalion Communications Company, 2nd Marine Division. In 1979, we were still at the height of the Cold War, with our principal adversary being the Soviet Union and the other Warsaw Pact nations, such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. They were all under the umbrella of the Soviet Union. Of course, the U.S. had a substantial NATO presence in Western Europe, mainly in West Germany, but the potential for a Soviet armored division to roll through the Fulda Gap was always looming. Therefore, we would conduct various exercises to simulate a Soviet attack onto the plains and forests of Western Europe. Camp Lejeune was a good stand-in for Europe due to the forested areas and the fields and meadows. And preparations were made for one of these exercises, like I said, in the spring of 1979. I'm sure it had a name, but I don't recall it. Now, when we would set up for one of these exercises, the first things we would do is set up a command post, which would include your communications vans containing radio, teletype, telephone, and cryptology equipment to ensure communications between the combat units, support units, and the command post. Generators were set up and various lines were run. It normally took about a week or so to set up this communications equipment prior to the start of the exercise. And I mentioned the word cryptology, and that's not to be confused with cryptid. Cryptology is basically a way to ensure secure communications, converting the communications to gibberish so that the enemy doesn't intercept the actual messages. However, when it reaches the intended party, they have the proper communications and cryptology gear. It's decoded into a readable or understandable format. Since I was getting short meaning I was close to being discharged, I was assigned guard duty to stay watch over the equipment at night. During the daytime, various people were out there setting it up from, say, 7 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. And then at night, myself and 6 other Marines would go out there, and we would basically guard the equipment. Now, it's funny, we were guarding some sensitive equipment, but I was the only one that was armed. I was armed with a Colt 45 semi-automatic revolver. And this was something that I would check out of the armory at approximately 4 in the afternoon, go out to the setup, and we would stay till approximately 7 in the morning when the day people came. And then I would go back to the armory, check it back in, and do this for the 4 or 5 days that we were involved in the setup. I mean, it's not like something I could carry with me around the base or anything like that. That's why it was always at the Army or on me at the particular site we were located. The other Marines were not armed. I was the only one that was armed, and I was considered Sergeant of the Guard. So what we would do is we'd get there at approximately 5 o'clock to 5:30 in the afternoon. It's still daylight. I think it probably would have gotten dark at 7:30 at that time of year, just before summer started and the longer days. And I would have a clipboard, and I would take somebody with me, and we'd walk around to the various areas and check off that everything was secure. The vans were locked, no signs of tampering, everything seemed secure. And it was probably generally what we did, and we would do the rounds every couple hours, and this would go on all night long. And normally the way I did it is I would have a different Marine every 2 hours do the walk around with me, and the other guys could sleep. During the time in between each guard round, or whatever you want to call it, we would cook hot dogs over a fire. We had a large bonfire, which we made with dead wood that was laying around. We'd chop some trees that were already dead, and we'd drag it over there and make a pretty good-sized bonfire. And we would make hot dogs and marshmallows, things like that, and eat them and tell the usual stories Marines tell, which is probably not fit for family consumption tonight. So what was funny, though, is that a number of bears, these were black bears, would gather around the fire, probably within 5 feet of us. We would be in a semicircle, and the bears would be around us in kind of a semicircle, and there would probably be up to 10, 12 bears, maybe double our number, and they would sit there, and you could have a 3 or 4 foot long stick with a piece of marshmallow or a piece of hot dog on it, and turn around and hold it out to the bear, and the bear would eat it off the stick. And these were mother bears with cubs. They were male bears, and there was no aggression. They were fine. It was just funny that everybody just sat there quietly, and it was kind of a weird sight. And now in retrospect, it's just bizarre. But at the time, it just didn't seem that way because it just seemed like so natural. So I believe on the 4th night we were there, which probably would have been a Thursday, it's approximately 10:30 at night now. It's pitch black, and I'm assuming that there was not a full moon, but even if there was, it probably wouldn't have illuminated too much of the ground. Myself and another Marine who was from Hawaii, was a Samoan, a Lance Corporal, which was an E3, were making our rounds. Now, you have to understand, I still have the pistol. It's in a shoulder holster, actually, not on my hip. And I've got a clipboard, and every time we would go to a different van, I would check it off. He's carrying a large flashlight, and really the only lights we had were the flashlights that we had and the fire, the bonfire. Now, as we were making our rounds, there was one other Marine that was still up. We were sleeping in large tents, and he was sitting by the fire, and I don't recall any of the bears being around at this time. It was fairly quiet, no sign of any other animals. We were probably, maybe 100 feet from the tent and the fire and the other Marine. And we heard, or I assume we both heard it because I heard it, a snarl or a growl directly in front of me, but in a thicket with a very, very large pine tree. So it's just pitch black. And I said to the other Marine, I said, "Shine your light there. What is that?" Something to that effect. And he shined his light on this thicket, and all I can tell you, Vic, is that what we saw defies imagination. It was, I'm 6'3", he was over 6 foot. We're looking up at this, whatever this was, which I'm going to call a dog man because that would be the only way I could describe it. And we're 15, 20 feet away looking up at this. Now, if it was a bear or if it was pretty much anything else, it would have been at eye level. We were looking up, I would say, estimating its height, over 7 feet. That would probably be a conservative estimate or guesstimate. It could have been closer to 7.5 feet. Black, snout, large ears, erect, and one, I'm going to call it an arm, for want of a better term, hanging down, and the other arm kind of bent with large claws. And I guess the body would be best described as like the Sasquatch, classic Sasquatch type body, but certainly not the head or the ears. This all happened within a span of a second and a half. I mean, I think we both let out a yell. We ran into each other, dropped the clipboard, dropped the flashlight. The flashlight was still partially illuminating the area where this creature was. I remember grabbing the other Marine and turning him around. I'm to his left, he's to my right. I turned him around bodily and I'm yelling, "Go, go, go." and we're just start running through the woods, banging into trees, tripping over roots, what have you. Out of the corner of my left eye, as I'm looking, I see the Marine sitting by the fire jumped up and grabbed the axe. So whatever kind of scream or yell we did, it scared him. Now, I'm going to assume that whatever we saw, the dog man went to, which would have been our left, his right, because he did not cross in front of where the light was still illuminating towards the fire, kind of towards where he was, and the Marine, so the other Marine would have seen it if he would have went in the same direction as us. It obviously went in the opposite direction. So after we kind of collected our thoughts and our hearts stopped beating out of our chest, we went back to the campsite or the tent and picked up another couple flashlights and went back out again and retrieved our flashlight and the clipboard. And I possibly may have had the 45 drawn, and I don't really recall if I did or not. I may have had it out. I know that I did not have a round in the chamber because I was not allowed to have a round in the chamber. I just had the 6 or 7 rounds in the clip. And as I keep thinking more about this over, it's been a while, it's a possibility I did have the pistol out and drawn. To make a long story short, never saw anything else there. The guy at the fire said, "What did you guys see?" I think I said it was just a big bear. And as we talked privately, his exact words were, "What the heck was that? That was like the size of a Kodiak bear." And I said, "Well, you obviously know there's no Kodiak bears here. The only thing are black bears, and that thing was no black bear. That thing was monstrous." And that's basically it. It was a very short encounter. It scared the heck out of me and scared the heck out of him. But we did agree if anybody ever asked us, it was a bear. No reason to go into any more detail about it because he had a couple more years left in the Marine Corps. I was short, and we just figured leaving well enough alone was the way to do it. And that's basically it, Vic.
I know it was dark where you saw it, but did you get a chance to see what its legs looked like?
Never saw the legs, or if I did, I don't recall. And I know that I've heard other callers talk about the classic dog-type legs or muscular-type dog legs, and I don't recall that. I may not have seen it below the knees, but to me it was more of that, like I said, more of a classic Sasquatch look, like just a big, hairy man look. That would be the best way to describe it. I did not notice, and I'm not to say that they weren't like that. I just don't recall that. I just recall more of the upper body probably from mid-thigh up to the head.
If you had to describe its head study, do you think its head looked more like a dog's head or more like a baboon's head?
More like a dog's head, definitely. Because a baboon's got kind of a weirder, different type of snout. This was more pointed, more like a dog. And it was more like a dog, definitely, because a baboon is different facial features or different cranial features.
Yeah, sounds like it just might have been a canine type. Let me ask you this, though. In your studies on the topic of dogmen, did you ever wind up seeing that picture of the Beast of 7 Chutes?
No, I haven't, Vic. I'm not familiar with that.
When you get a chance and you're on the computer next time, do me a favor, look up the Beast of 7 Chutes. After you have a chance to take a look at that creature, I want you to let me know how that compared to what you saw that night.
Okay. I'll make a note of that.
Yeah, if you can, take a look at that photo and get back with me to let me know. I'd love to hear what you had to say.
Sure.
That'd be great. How well could you tell what color it was?
It was direct illumination, and we were close, and it was black as night, which is probably why, even though it was very dark in the area, we didn't even know anything was there because it was blended right in with the black background. It was as black as midnight.
You know how it is, Tom. Sometimes because of the flashlight you're using or other factors, because of the light that's hitting something like that, you can have a situation where something that's actually black might appear brown. So I was just wondering how good of an idea you had on its color. That's why I asked you about that. But I don't doubt you. It sounds like you had a really good look at it. And if you think it was blacker than black, I believe you.
Even though it was a short second and a half at most, it was enough to take in a lot. And I stand behind the fact that it was black. I know a Kodiak bear, for instance, is brown, but I think when the other Marine made that analogy, I think he meant more from size than description as far as the fur or the color.
Oh, sure. No, that makes good sense. Please tell us more about those claws that you saw. Can you describe them more thoroughly?
Very long, I would say the length of my fingers, which I'm a 6'3" guy, so I have pretty large hands, 4 inches, 5 inches long, maybe. Well, maybe not. My fingers aren't that long, but I would say that the claws are probably 4 or 5 inches long.
Ooh.
And black.
Were the claws curved somewhat like a black bear's, or were they more straight like a grizzly bear's?
I would say they were somewhere in between.
Okay, I see. From how you related what happened, it sounds to me like you never saw that dogman move from the spot where you saw it initially. Is that true?
No. The light, once we dropped it, it partially illuminated, but it was pointed more towards the fire where the other Marine was sitting. That wasn't involved in this. And that's why I'm positive it went to its right instead of our right, because it would have crossed in front of that illumination, because he was looking at us as we're running. I mean, this all happens in a matter of seconds, obviously, or tenths of a second, whatever. But when I say he, I see the other Marine, so he would have had to have seen that cross in that light, so it obviously went in the opposite direction.
That makes sense. Besides you and the Marine who was with you that night, did you find out later that other Marines saw that dogman too?
No, I don't recall anybody ever speaking about that, and obviously if they had, I would have recalled it. That's not to say that they didn't, it's just that nobody talked about it.
When that dogman was standing there looking at you, did it ever give any indications it was thinking about becoming aggressive towards you?
Other than the initial snarl or growl, which is why we put the light on it, no. It may even have been a situation that we startled it as much as it startled us. And obviously, if it was super aggressive or wanted us, it could have had us. I mean, it was close enough, and from what I understand about the way these things can jump and how quick they are, he'd have been on us in a second or less. I wouldn't even have been able to break leather with the pistol. He would have been on me. It would have been all she wrote. And plus, there wasn't even a round in the chamber, so would just add to the agony.
Yeah, that doesn't help. I guess you could have tried to pistol whip him, but that probably wouldn't have gotten you that far.
And I'll tell you, Vic, the pistol was the last thing on my mind. I didn't even think about it as all this was happening until we kind of regrouped and went back to the campsite there. So pistol wasn't even an issue in my mind. And I didn't even think about it.
Well, that doesn't make you any different than a lot of eyewitnesses who have firearms or cameras. That's the last thing on their mind, so that's why they don't shoot, that's why they don't try to take a picture. Do you have any idea what it was doing there?
It could have been coming around for food. It could have just been investigating what the bears were investigating. It could have heard us. It could have been curious, any number of things. We could have been in its territory. It possibly had young, who knows? I mean, any number of things, Vic, like actually any other animal that would come investigate when people were encroaching on its territory.
Yeah, it does sound like it's one of those who knows type situations. Were there any strange scents when all this was going on?
I don't recall anything out of the ordinary. No, I don't, Vic.
How about its fur? How would you describe it?
Thick and coarse would probably be the best way to describe it, and from what I could see in that short time I saw it, I couldn't see any muscle definition or anything like that, so it was fairly thick all over the body. The least amount of fur would have been on the head, and of course in the paws or claws or whatever you want to call them didn't have quite as much fur. And again, like I said, this took place in a second and a half, so I wish I had a better description, but that's probably the best I can give you.
Oh no, that's fine. Under the circumstances, I totally understand. I was going to ask you if you noticed any matting in the fur, but with that quick glance that you got, I don't think you would have noticed that.
No, I couldn't tell you that, if there was any matting.
Oh, that's understandable. Before you saw that dog man, did you notice a lack of ambient noise in the area?
I don't recall anything out of the ordinary as far as not hearing crickets or anything, any forest sounds. I think it was fairly normal. But again, we're talking almost, 28 years ago, so it could have possibly happened. I just don't recall that feature.
Oh, that's no problem. It has been a long time. Because you had that encounter, has your belief in the existence of Sasquatch been changed?
I would have to say, Vic, that I was a skeptic, but I think a lot about people who report these incidences, and I know there's always crackpots and people who want attention, but some of these people, particularly when you have law enforcement officers or seemingly normal people, and they swear that they saw something, you tend to start to want to believe this. And I guess the skeptic in me was, well, how come they've never recovered a body? Well, maybe they have recovered bodies, we just don't know about it. I don't know. But yeah, I think there's something out there. I think there's things out there that the government may know about that they don't want the rest of us to know about. And I think there's a lot of mysteries that are out there. Hopefully one day those mysteries will be solved and the truth will come out.
Considering your time in the military, I think you'd be the last person I would need to tell that if the military came into possession of a body of a dog man, you know full well that that's not something that would be broadcast to the public.
No, they try to make a weapon out of it. I mean, that's what they do, right?
Yeah, that'd make one heck of a weapon, too.
There you go.
Has there ever been a time after your encounter when you thought another dogman might have been near?
No, but I've been hunting, or I used to be a hunter. I used to hunt waterfowl, feral hog, wild turkey, deer years ago in Mississippi and Florida. I don't do that anymore, but I can't say that I ever had any type of possible encounter after that or suspected there was anything else out there. I mean, I've seen bears out there before, and I knew it was a bear. And I went the other direction because they probably weren't going to be quite as friendly as the bears you ran to in North Carolina. But no, I can't say that I've had any type of encounters since my original or initial or only encounter.
Well, that's good. Since that dogman you saw didn't lash out at you when it could have easily done that, do you think dogmen aren't quite as dangerous as they're made out to be?
Well, Vic, just because you see a dangerous wild animal out in the woods, whether it be a cougar or a panther or a bear, elk, a wild hog, it doesn't attack you doesn't mean it's a gentle creature or it's tame or it's not dangerous. It's just the one time it didn't do something aggressive. So I'm going to go with it's probably an aggressive creature and it's something you don't mess around with.
That's a really good point and a good way to look at it. How close is the nearest woods to where you live now?
Very, very close. Within half a mile.
That is close. It sounds to me like you're dealing with your encounter really well, but were there any unexpected effects your encounter had on you?
Well, I think I had some nightmares or bad dreams for a short time afterwards, and I used to like to camp, and well, I did continue to hunt, but I liked to camp, and I used to like to hike, but I don't think I ever entered the woods again without a weapon, whether it be a long rifle or a shotgun for hunting. I just not something I would do again, and frankly, if I was going to camp out, which I don't think I've even done, but if I was going to camp out, it would be in a cabin with running water and an indoor plumbing as opposed to going out to an outhouse. I'm not wandering around out in the woods without some type of weapon.
Well, I can't say I'll blame you. Now that you know they're out there, it definitely changes things. What did your nightmares consist of?
Well, being chased by something like this and running and trying to lose it, and it's still there, and it's on all fours, and then it's running bipedal, and then it's all fours and trying to escape this thing and not being able to escape it.
Because of those nightmares, knowing that they'd be waiting on you, did you ever suffer through insomnia for a short while after that encounter?
Well, I mean, if a nightmare would wake me up, it was difficult to get back to sleep because you'd think about this incident. And eventually, Vic, I gotta tell you, I just kind of buried it in my subconscious. I just kind of put it away and moved on with life.
Well, a lot of eyewitnesses bury it like that. Long as it worked for you, that's good, but as you know now, you eventually have to deal with it.
That's for sure.
And I'm glad you did, too. Have you done anything special to try and help yourself get over that experience?
Well, like I said, I kind of buried it. I was out of the Marine Corps in July of '79. I went to college and did all the college type things and had fun, and I just kind of buried that thing so deep down that I never really spoke about it. And I have told the story to other people, but when I've told the story, it was just a large bear. And I never went into any other detail, it being a possible Sasquatch or something else, or a dog man, obviously. And I just kind of figured a big bear was a good way to tell the story. It's kind of a humorous story to other people, especially when they found out I had a weapon and I didn't even think about using it and ran into the other guy, kind of like Abbott and Costello or the Three Stooges or something. And so I got some laughs about it, but I was never going to go tell the real story.
Yeah, if you would have revealed that it was a dog man instead of a bear, I know you would have gotten a totally different response, that's for sure.
That's for sure. And I've actually told family members, and they looked at me like, really? Come on, you can do better than that. And I told my boss here at the law office, and he kind of just changed the subject. I guess he just didn't want to embarrass me. So that's basically, it's not something that I share with anybody other than this show here.
After having to experience such a horrible thing as what you went through that night, it's such a shame you have to deal with responses like that when you reach out for help. That's horrible.
That's why I think that there's more incidences of UFO sightings by pilots who don't report it for obvious reasons, or maybe law enforcement individuals who don't report either a UFO or a dog man or a Sasquatch encounter because of what's going to happen. You'll be ridiculed, laughed at, what have you, considered to be nuts. So that's why I think there's a lot of valid sightings that are never, ever, ever related to anyone. And these people take these stories to the grave.
Well, for good reason, like the reasons you just mentioned.
Well, as you may remember, initially when I sent you my email about this, I indicated I didn't want to be on the show. Then after thinking about it and speaking with you, after you contacted me, I thought, what the heck, what have I got to lose? I'll tell it like it is, and if people believe it, they do, and if they don't, well, that's within their prerogative also.
I am glad you changed your mind and decided to come on. I'm not sure how closely you follow the show or not, Tom, but I actually narrated your encounter on an episode about maybe a month or so ago. It's kind of convenient that I'm mentioning that right now because if I don't, I know there are going to be a bunch of people scratching their heads wondering, you know what? This encounter sounds awfully familiar. Well, if it does sound familiar, that's why.
Well, tell me what number it is, because I've listened to a lot of the shows, so I want to listen to it.
You know what? I'm not exactly sure. I think it might have been around maybe 126, 128 in that area, I believe.
Well, I will listen to that tonight.
That sounds good. It might have been in Dogman Encounters Bedtime Stories too, but don't hold me to that because I don't know for sure. I think I did some narrations after that show even, and if I did, I think it's on that episode.
All right, that sounds like a winner. I'm definitely going to listen. I'm going to check for it.
Sounds good. How long was it after you had that encounter before you feel you're able to function somewhat normally again?
Oh, I would say within a few days. Once the exercise started, I was back in main side, which was the main part of the base. We were working 12-hour shifts because they split the company in half. Half were out in the field working 12-hour shifts. Half of us were at main side doing 12-hour shifts. And you're so busy because you're working 12 on, 12 off that you just kind of put everything aside and do your job.
Well, I'm glad you're able to deal with it so well. Like I said before, that's good to hear. How much trouble did you have going into the woods alone after having that experience?
I never really went back in the woods unless I was hunting and I had a firearm, whether it be a Remington 1100 shotgun or a 30-06 or something of that ilk. I just never went out without some kind of firearm. And I don't know if it was a subconscious defense that I did. And I wasn't even a big-time hunter. Let me put it this way, Vic. I go out there more to be out in the woods. I really wasn't that interested in shooting the animals. I just like to be out there in the woods, but I kind of felt, I guess, deep down inside that I should probably have a firearm for some type of protection.
Yeah, you're not the only person who goes out into the woods for that reason. Not to shoot anything, but just to enjoy the woods. And you did mention earlier about the fact that you did go out hunting, but there are a lot of eyewitnesses who head out into the woods with a rifle, but they don't feel any sort of protection from that rifle, and for good reason, too. They still are really anxious about being out there, so I wondered as far as you went, how much trouble, how much anxiety you still had when you went out alone like that, even with that hunting rifle or a shotgun.
Well, I haven't been out there in years, Vic, with children and marriage and work and all that, so I don't have the free time I used to have. But I think if I was to go back out again, I'd still be armed. I'd obviously go get a hunting license just so I'm covered in that respect, but I would be armed, but I wouldn't probably shoot anything. But just to make myself feel better, I'd probably have some type of firearm on me.
Well, now that you know they're out there, I can't say I blame you. But even if you didn't have to worry about dogmen being out there, I still think it's a good idea to have some kind of a weapon like that on you.
Well, I mean, there's any number of things out there. You have to worry about snakes. You worry about hog. They'll come after you. You never know. So it's just better to be safe than sorry.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, it's a good idea. Have you ever tried talking friends or family out of going into the woods because of your experience?
No, but I don't really want to relate what I saw because then it gets into a whole big thing about trying to tell my story. I've never really tried to talk anybody out of going in the woods, but normally when they do, and my family's not a big bunch of hunters, but everybody owns weapons, firearms. So I guess normally if they were to go out there, they probably would be armed.
Well, there are a lot of eyewitnesses who, without telling about what they actually saw, they'll still try to talk family and friends out of going out into the woods in a roundabout way because of what they know now that's out there.
Well, you're probably right in that respect, Vic, but I just kind of figured I didn't want to have to explain myself to anybody. They're grown-ups, and I guess they can decide how they wish to proceed. And again, like I said, normally everybody does own weapons, but we're not a big-time hunting family. So I would assume that normally if they did go out there, they probably would be armed just basically for coyotes or for snakes or for maybe, hog or something like that, just to be safe from those animals.
Yeah, anything can happen out there, so it's good to be prepared. Have you told your wife about your experience? You said that you haven't really shared it with most of the family, but when it comes to your wife, did you share it with her?
Yes, she laughed. She doesn't believe it. She just thinks I saw a big bear. I'm not going to argue with her. So whatever.
Wow.
Yeah, a world record bear. A world record bear.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, that would be a Boone and Crockett black bear, no doubt about that.
That's for sure.
Yeah, they don't grow 'em that big. You used to spend time in Taylor, Mississippi years ago. What kinds of things did you do there?
As you know, Vic, I attended and graduated from the University of Mississippi, which is in northern Mississippi, about an hour south of Memphis, and close to Taylor, Mississippi, probably 15, 20 minutes away. We used to go to a country kitchen type place called Ruth and Jimmy's there to eat on occasion. And frankly, Taylor, Mississippi is in the middle of nowhere. A lot of two-lane roads back there. It's a heavily forested region. Though I did hunt in Mississippi, and I may have even have hunted in that area, I don't recall anything strange or out of the ordinary. They have a great deer population there, and I think that's normally what we hunted was white-tailed deer.
Yeah, well, from the way you described that area, it sounds like it'd be a really good habitat for dogmen, and as I'm sure you realize, a lot of people have claimed to have had encounters with dogmen there, but since you spent a fair amount of time there, what are your thoughts on the possibility that dogmen actually are in that area, considering your experiences there?
Well, I mean, in retrospect, it is a very heavily forested area. I mean, it's thick, old-growth woods there. And I know that probably at one time they might have had some logging there and things of that nature. It wouldn't surprise me due to the nature of the terrain that something like that could exist. I mean, if you were to go hunting there, it's some very, very thick woods. I mean, and it's not a real hospitable place for someone to be wandering around. So I could see something lurking around out there and not being detected, or if they were detected, being able to run off and hide. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility at all.
Well, it sounds like the perfect place for them to live, so I wouldn't be all that surprised. Now that it's been 30 years since you had that encounter, how well are you dealing with your encounter? Are you in as good of a place as it sounds like you are?
Well, I basically put it behind, and it's nice to be able to talk to you about this because this was something that I just wasn't going to relate to anybody. But for the fact that I've heard your show on a number of occasions and spoken with you, it made it a lot easier. And it is kind of a weight off my chest, I guess, to talk about it to somebody who's not going to ridicule me or laugh at me or whatever.
Well, like I said earlier to you, it sounds to me like you're in a really good place now, but I am glad that you came on the show and talked about this.
Well, I appreciate you having me on the show, Vic. It was an honor being on the show and a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh, it's been great having you on. Before we get out of here, do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
Well, I'd just like to say to the non-believers that there is something out there, whether you believe it or not, and I was probably a non-believer till I was 22 years old when this occurred. There's stuff out there we don't know about, and you might want to take stock in the fact that there's a lot of people who are reputable people who aren't nuts, crackpots, storytellers or whatever that have had experiences, and not everybody's a liar. Not everybody's trying to make an economic gain from this. There's something out there, and just be aware of that.
That's well said. Yeah, there are a lot of people out there who've had experiences with these things who never asked to have these experiences. It's just something that happened.
Well, I agree with you.
Yeah, it really is unfortunate. Well, thanks again so much for your time, Tom. Thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about that experience with us. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Vic.
Oh, it's been great talking with you. Have a great night, okay?
Thank you, Vic. You too. Bye.
Bye. Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had an encounter of your own and would like to speak with me whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. Before we bring on tonight's guest, I'm going to read an encounter for you that took place in Jackson County, Kansas. Since it was summer break from my school, I was lazily lounging at home watching TV. I got bored, so I went outside to see if I could do anything with my chickens, like feed them worms and snails. Before I go into more detail, I should explain the area I live in. My home is on the outskirts of the city I live in. I had about 5 to 7 chickens at the time, and we hadn't expanded the coop, so it was a small pen connected to 2 sides of the chicken coop, which was wooden and sturdy. The only way to get into the coop is either through the trap door attached to the big door or one of the 3 windows. One window is on one side of the door and the second window is on the other side. The third window is a large window. Keep in mind that they all have traps connected to them so they can be closed. We have 7 acres of woodland that we call the back pasture, and if you'd ever go back there, you'd see that it's a popular habitat for the local deer. There was also a wild boar that was roaming around back there at the time. I don't know how it got there. We had been having trouble with poachers for a while because of the population of deer in the woods. One poacher had set up a trail cam that was motion activated. There was an old rusty deer stand that had been put on a tree a long time ago, and the tree had begun to grow around it. Beyond our acres of woods, there was a large cornfield owned by our neighbors. Beyond that was forest. I don't know what the forest was like beyond the field since I never went back there. I had gone outside to do something with my chickens and brought along a bucket of corn for feeding the deer after I had finished. When I walked out of my home, I saw that a doe was sitting in the tall grass. I thought it was sleeping since it had its head down and wasn't moving. Being the curious little nut I was, I decided to sneak up on the deer and get a picture of it to show my mother when she got home from work. I crept as silently as I could across the yard that separated me from the deer. I should also mention that we have a clearing with a burn pit in it that was filled with cedar branches. I was creeping across my yard towards the deer, and when I had cleared the burn pit and was about 10 yards from it, I realized that the deer wasn't asleep. It was dead. It was the most disgusting sight I had ever seen. Its intestines were completely gone, the flesh on the body of the doe had been shredded to pieces, and blood was absolutely everywhere. It looked as if it had been sitting there for a while, and it smelled like it too. Most of the blood was dry, and the air reeked with the stench of rotting flesh, urine, and what seemed like a hint of wet dog. Something that creeped me out about the scene was, although it was a rotting carcass, there were no insects at all around it. It was as if the usual lively forest was deader than the deer. Not even the neighbor's cattle were making a sound. It looked as if the poor deer had simply been left after being brutally attacked and half-eaten, which it most likely was. I left the bucket at the beginning of the trail, thinking I would come out later with my mother and green the deer when she got home. I had just barely started to walk back to my house when I heard a low, snarling growl that sounded like a wolf. It sounded distorted, though, as if it were being played on an old radio. Sorry, that's the only way I can think of describing it. Against my better judgment, I turned my head around, and that's when I saw what looked like the biggest freaking wolf I'd ever seen. It was on all fours, and its fur was black and matted in places. Its face was what you'd expect a wolf's face to look like, although it was broad and the muzzle seemed a little short. The way it was curling its lips made it look as if its snout was plenty long and its eyes were yellow. Not a bright yellow like the yellow of a flower or the sun, but a dim amber red yellow, if that makes any sense. Its ears looked like that of a Doberman Pinscher with the cropped effect. Its front legs were long, and it looked as if it were a bodybuilder. Its paws, if you can even call them paws, looked like huge hands with long claws at the end of them. It stood up, and I heard the most sickening popping sound you could ever imagine. It sounded like the sound of popping joints, but it seemed amplified as if it were being played through a microphone and the sound was coming out of loudspeakers. Its body looked like a bodybuilder's pumped up on steroids, it was so big. It had no tail that I could see, and it seemed to tower over me even though I was a good 10 meters from it. I was about 5'4" tall at the time, and I came nowhere close to its height. It was so tall that the tip of its ears could almost touch the top of a young cedar. It let out a loud howl which sounded more like a roar, and then it charged at me. Doing the only thing I knew to do while hyped up on fear and adrenaline, I began to run away from it. I remember clearing my yard in what seemed like hours, but was most likely only a few seconds, and running inside, slamming and locking all the doors and windows. As I calmed down a little bit, I realized that if it had really wanted to kill me, it would have. I hadn't experienced an attack charge, but rather a bluff charge. I was lucky to get away with my life. Although this happened almost 2 years ago, it still terrifies me to think about it. The deer was gone the next day, and ever since that evening, I've been weary around the woods, only going in them in broad daylight, and only going in them when I absolutely have to, and never without a weapon. Sadly, I can't say that I'm one of those people who have stopped experiencing things after their encounter. While I only had nightmares for a month after that day in June, nothing really started to happen again until about 2 months ago when I was staying up at night playing on the laptop. I had started to hear things moving around on the porch, so I turned on the light out there. That's when I saw the shape of something huge disappearing behind the corner of my house. There was also one of the rare times I went into the woods after the first encounter when I was helping my mother clear brush from the hunting clearing. I was going to get the mower and was walking the trail to do so when I heard bipedal footsteps following me off to my side. They stopped whenever I stopped. I eventually ran out of the woods, and I haven't been back there since. I asked my late great-grandmother about the creature I had seen in the woods, and she informed me that there was something called the wolf-head man that stalked the Kansa tribe, preying on small children who strayed too far from their teepees. Later, I was informed by my history teacher that my house had actually been built on a tribal burial ground. I've since been wondering if that had something to do with my experiences. I hadn't heard about the Wolfhead Man before she had told me about it. When I saw that there were several eyewitness reports that were proven to be truthful, it made me feel a lot better about coming out with this information. I had attempted to tell people previous to this submission, but everyone either said I was stupid, crazy, or just a plain liar. One thing's for certain, I'm not stupid, I'm not crazy, and I'm most definitely not a liar. I know what I saw, and what I saw was a dog man. Signed, Anonymous. Time, 3:45 p.m. Date, June 8th, 2015. Alright, let's bring on tonight's guest. Tonight's guest has been on the show several times, and I'm glad to welcome him back for tonight's show. Of course, I'm talking about Josh Turner. Josh, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, it's always good to be back.
Oh, it's great having you. For the listeners who haven't heard prior shows you've done, please tell them about yourself.
Well, there's not much to tell. I run a security company, live in Austin, Texas, and that's pretty much it. It's one of those things I could talk a lot about myself or keep it short, and that's pretty much it. That's the short of it.
What was it that got you into this dogman thing in the first place?
Oh, of course, my encounter. I had an encounter when I was 15. Like I've said before, there wasn't a lot of information. You know, the only thing you could find about these things was werewolves, werewolves, werewolves. That's all there was, because I had no way to correspond with anyone. The only thing is that my half-brother is from Michigan, and he is the first time that somebody had ever mentioned anything of Dogman, whatever, but I don't think that he truly knew what it was, what a Dogman was, and if it was the same thing that I had seen. But way back, that was the first person that had ever said Dogman or whatever because of the Michigan Dogman. And plus, you know, he had friends that would talk about it, but admittedly, he said that he didn't really pay attention much to it, you know, and I wasn't interested in any of that kind of stuff. You know, it was sports and stuff like that, you know, and this thing kind of blindsided me. I mean, there were stories about it growing up, and I just completely ignored them because I thought they were all just fairy tales, you know.
Oh yeah, that's understandable. And there's nothing like having an encounter the way you did to get you into the topic.
Yeah. Because I really wanted to know what it was. It wasn't until the internet took off, and I had a girlfriend that, short of it, is that she was the first of any of my girlfriends that I'd ever had that I actually opened up to, because I'd had a nightmare. I was having nightmares, and I wouldn't tell her what it was, and then finally I opened up to her. So she's like, well, we can look this up. So she got on the internet, and then there was all this information about these things. But even then, it wasn't like Dogman. It was like everybody has different names for them. You know what I mean? There's all this, Dogman has kind of become the catch-all term for it or whatever. And of course, people like you and your show have like, that name has now become, that's what it is. You know, that's what we call it.
Yeah, things were in their infancy back then. I'm glad that so much more info is out there on the internet now and available to people who have these encounters. Since you were on the show last time, what have you been up to?
Not a lot. Work. I don't even know, you know, like sometimes months go by and I don't even know, like, where did it go? You know what I'm saying? It's like, I guess the main thing I've been trying to do was get back in touch, or try to find a time when I could get back in touch with Jerry's family to talk to his uncles, but it just hasn't worked out. It's always been something. The oldest brother died in November, and then there was this whole problem with the deed to the property, whatever, and then December was real hectic. Christmas, I usually really like Christmas. I'm a big Christmas person, but this Christmas was so stressful, and I was just glad to have it over with. Everybody got what they wanted. Good. Okay, it's over. Whew, you know, and then January, we were really busy with work. And then February, finally did it. Finally got in touch with these people and was able to get what I needed. So yeah, that's what I've been doing since the last time I was on.
Well, I'm glad you're able to reach them that way then. Now that you have people contacting you to share their dogman encounters with you, is there anything about this that surprised you?
No, because I know people. People are strange, and some of the people that I talk to are very, very nice people. They're very, very down-to-earth people, but there are some strange people. There are some people who have some weird fetishes or whatever, like costumes. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's whatever. But I have been surprised, I guess, by the number of people from outside the country that listen to your show was the biggest surprise. I was telling one of my nephews the other day that I can't believe how many people from Europe like your show. That's crazy. It's weird.
It is amazing how some people from places you didn't even think of that had people listening to the show will reach out and contact you. But anyway, now that you've been studying dogmen for some time, after seeing the one you saw, do you think this dogman situation is milder than you first thought or more intense?
Oh, it's definitely more intense. I mean, the stories I'm about to tell you were intense. I thought when I was getting this story that, I was going to hyperventilate it first. I was like, you know what I mean? It's really amazing, and it seems like the further down the rabbit hole you go, the deeper it gets. There was actually a story that I got from someone who had contacted me from Iceland, or is from Iceland. I don't know if they live there now, but they were from Iceland. And that's weird because they have stories of these dogmen that supposedly live in these giant caverns. They have all these caverns that have been carved out by the ice and the volcanoes. And supposedly they have people that they have kidnapped and that they breed them as cattle. That's a scary thought. I mean, and that's what this girl told me. And I'm just like, wow. She said that if you end up down there in one of those caverns, because she said there's a whole host of creatures that supposedly live in those caves. Who knows, man? I mean, that's scary to think about, them using people as food. When you really put it in perspective, it's like we're their prey, if they want us to be, and that's the part that really blows my mind. And to think that at one time, of course it was at one time and it was years and years ago, but to have been as close as I was to one of these things is just, I don't know, it's a scary thought. It's a very scary thought.
Yeah, that is a pretty uncomfortable thought. All right, Josh, you've got new info to share with us, so let's get into that now. Give us every last detail you can remember.
Okay. As you know, before, I had been talking to some people that I had met back in the summertime, and they live out in the country, and I'm not going to give the exact area or anything like that, but I've been using aliases to protect their identity and not giving the exact coordinates of where they're at or whatever. But it's not really that far from where I live, which is disturbing. I mean, it's far enough away to where I'm not too worried about it, but it's a little too close. But the guy that I was corresponding with, his name is Jerry. He's the guy that I talked to the most, and we became kind of like friends. Since then, I've met his brothers, I've met his uncles, I've met all these different people, but me and him are still pretty much friends. So I've been talking to him, and through him I met a guy named Shane Hitchens, who has a property adjacent to his. And apparently this whole property has been a home to these dogmen for a long, long time. And so I just was blown away by some of their personal encounters. And I thought, these guys, they have relatives that are an older generation that have been living out there for a long time. And I thought, if there was a way to get in touch with their uncles, their grandparents, their dad, there's got to be some more stories, because they were telling me that they could tell me a lot more than they could, because all they had was their personal encounters and then the stories handed down. And when a story is from a previous generation, it gets watered down, then it gets passed down again, it gets watered down. So the further back you go and the closer to the event, the people that were told it firsthand, that's where you get the information from. And so I was determined to try to get a hold of these guys, but it's one thing after another, and I almost got it done in January, but then they had a quinceañera, which for those of you who don't know, it's for girls when they turn 15. So it's a Mexican culture thing. And so they had a big quinceañera, and then there was a birthday, and then there was this and there was that. And it never did work out. We just kept having one issue after another. And so it was just like, when am I going to get to talk to these people? Finally, I got it done. And, as soon as I got my story, I contacted you the next weekend after, because I wanted to make sure that when I talked about it, it was fresh in my mind, and I didn't want to have to put it off or whatever. So, and I honestly think there's still a little meat on the bone here with one of them that I interviewed. I think I'm becoming a better researcher, a better interviewer. And I don't know if that's what I am, but it seems like it's kind of evolved into amateur research in some way. I'm getting to where I'm better at asking these questions because there was something that was told to me by Jerry and his brothers and Shane that they kind of said, and I thought it was in jest, and I thought, well, this isn't really anything pertinent to anything, and so I didn't commit it to my mind. But then that comment, which is really what it was, just was a comment that kind of became a joke or something, and I thought that that's what it was, but it turned out that it was very important information, and I know now to interview people a little better. I'm not as thorough as you. You're the master, but I'm getting a little better at talking to these people and getting details, because just telling somebody the overview of a story, you got to try to fish out the details and get them to talk. I'm good at talking to people and I'm good at recounting things, but I realize now that there was still some things I need to work on, because I could have had that going into these interviews I did. I could have had that information ready. And when it was given to me, it all came back to me that I had already heard that before. So anyway, Jerry has two uncles. Well, he had four. One was his Uncle Adam, who died. Now, he died back in November, and that's a shame because I didn't get to interview him. Guy was 80 years old, going on 81, was still working on his farm, his ranch, and died working on a tractor. So, some of these country people, they work till the day they die. And I've seen that before with my own family, my family on my dad's side that lives out in the country, just working until they die. They tend to live longer, healthier lives because they grow what they eat. They eat what they grow. They just have a better diet. They live better, and they don't tend to retire. They just kind of work until that's it. But anyway, I missed my opportunity with him, and that's a shame because I'm sure he was the oldest brother of these brothers that I'm going to talk about now, which would be Jerry's uncles, and I missed that. And of course, Jerry's dad, Andrew, he was not willing to discuss his encounters. He didn't want to even talk about it. And according to what Noah and Abel, which are the guys I'm going to tell you about, they both seem to kind of agree that their dad, who was one of the original people out there that worked for the Hitchens, that their younger brother, Andrew, was the most like their dad. The dad never wanted to talk about it. He dealt with these things over and over again and never talked about it, never discussed it ever till the day he died. And it was just one of those things where they got the information that they got from his brother who died. And I guess his name was Lupe. Lupe, he had passed away a long, long time ago. So some of the stories from that previous generation were passed down by him and Art Hitchens, these stories that they had told that I'm about to tell you. But anyway, so what happened was I finally got a chance to interview Noah. Now, I got a hold of him first, and he is, I guess, Jerry's uncle, his dad's older brother. Now, like I said before, Adam, who was the oldest, his dad was named Adam too, so I don't want to confuse you. He's a junior of Adam Sr., and he's the one that died, and then his younger brother right below him was Abel, and then the next one down was Noah, and then Andrew, and then the youngest of all of them was Jojo, or Joseph. And Noah calls him the mistake. He said he wasn't supposed to be born. That's why he's so much younger than they were, because he goes, I didn't think my mother could still have children. And then out comes this kid, it's like, he was just like, but he was definitely, and the way JoJo had told me, it was kind of like he grew up as an only child, really, because all his brothers were older. They were way older. And so Joseph kind of like, he's the one closest to his nephews because he's closer in age to them. So Jerry and them, he's only about 10 years older than they are. So there's a little closer, whatever. But yeah, I think Abel was already like 20 years old when this kid was born or something. So JoJo, he kind of was like the black sheep, definitely. And I'll tell you a little more about him later on. Anyway, I started talking to Noah, and I'm going to give you some backstory here, okay? This guy, he's a vet. And when I first called this guy, it was like, who are you? Why are you calling me? Are you with the military? Are you with the government? And he started just asking me all these questions. And I thought that Jerry had told this guy. He was like, yeah, go ahead and call him. It's all good. It's cool. Well, it wasn't cool because at first this guy was like, I don't know you. I don't want to talk to you. And he hung up on me. And so I was going like, what the heck? So I called Jerry back and I said, this guy doesn't want to talk to me, man. And he goes, no. He's cool, man. So I guess he went over to his place later that afternoon and I called and I talked to him. And then he knew that I wasn't part of some government, that apparently they'd been out there. So that's another thing. But I had to put his mind at ease. And his next question was, what interest do you have in these things? Why do you want to know about these wolves? Because he calls them wolves. He don't call them dog man or anything like that. He says wolves. And I said, well, my interest in them is because I have had an encounter myself personally. And he's like, so? You know, it's very like, he's like, I've had three encounters with these things. He's like, so what? And I'm like, well, I want to know about it. And he goes, what, are you writing a book? I said, no, I'm not writing a book. I just want to know this information really for myself. And then I'm willing to share it with your audience and with you. But my own personal curiosity, I think any researcher will tell you that a lot of it's just for their own personal curiosity. You know, like my friend who's a Bigfoot researcher down in Tomball, his name's Armando. He's a good friend of mine and he's a Bigfoot researcher and he goes out into the thicket all the time and he searches. And I've talked to him extensively and I'm like, why do you do it? Because I don't want to search out there. You know what I mean? I don't want to go out there. And he says, dude, you know, he's like, Wolf, it's for me personally. I just want to know. I just want the truth. And that's what I did. I just want to know. I want to know what these things are. I just want to know. It's just like curiosity. I've met a lot of people like him over the years. I have an uncle who likes to drink and do stuff, you know, whatever. And this guy's like that. He's a drinker. About the hour and a half mark, he was already starting to get pretty sloshed. And I was like trying to get information at that point. It was like, well, okay. And the last half hour was just a lot of him talking about building cars and being in war and stuff. And so I was just like, okay, all right. And I could tell that this guy he's a pretty crazy guy. And his personality definitely is a contrast to Abel because they are two different people. And it's interesting because they have two different schools of thought on these dogmen. Noah, very matter-of-factly, he just thinks that they're like vermin or a nuisance that need to be killed. He goes, they're like coyotes or whatever. That's how he sees them. They're just pests. And if he sees one, I'm going to kill it. And I was like, well, hope you got a big gun. He goes, oh, I got lots of guns. And, you know, him being a vet, yeah, he definitely does. And he actually was outside at one point and fired off a couple rounds while I was on the phone with him. And it was like, wow, dude, really? So yeah, it was an interesting experience just talking to this cat. You know, it was just very interesting experience. And he basically had told me that if he sees one, it's going to be dead. He's not playing around with them. He's never entertained any kind of friendliness toward them, which is something that Abel did apparently. But he's like, I walk around my property, armor-piercing bullets, incendiary rounds, and he goes, I'm not afraid of them. He goes, they can be killed. We know that. So anyway, getting him to stay focused too was also kind of a task. And I finally got the information I needed from him. And I got probably twice as much information out of his brother in about half the time. Let's put it that way. But with Noah, I had to like kind of keep steering him back. So what happened was, and that gives you a little backstory into that guy. And that, like I said, is Jerry's uncle, the character. So anyway, I got this guy to tell me about the beginning. And he said, well, the beginning being like when I was born. And I'm like, well, is that the beginning? And he goes, it was for me. And I'm like, no. I mean, like the beginning. Your dad was on the property. What happened? I had heard that there were some real stories there. And he says, well, I can't tell you because I wasn't there. All I can tell you is what I was told and what I grew up knowing. And I said, do you believe it's true? He said, absolutely. He's like, that's what happened. So this is what he told me. He told me that it all started back in 1933. That's the exact year he gave me. But then again, this guy, who knows? He said it was during the Depression and it was in 1933. Okay. That's what he said. I don't know if that's the truth or what, but he said that in the early 30s, this is what I was able to figure out, that at some point in the early 30s, they found a hole. Now, the whole spread was owned by Amos Hitchens. which would be Shane's great-grandfather. His grandfather's name is Art, and his dad's name is Art, Art Jr. So anyways, there was this huge spread out there, and they had cattle. It was a ranch, and they had pigs, and they had chickens, and they had everything that a ranch has, whatever. But they had gotten really big, so they had about 14 vaqueros that worked for them. 10 of them were from Mexico, and 4 of them were Americans. 4 of them were huelillos, as we would say, white people. And the other 10 were Mexicanos, or Mexicans. And he said back then, I guess there had been like some sort of war or something down in Mexico. And a lot of these Mexicans, there was an influx of people trying to get jobs. And it was hard for them to compete back then because the Depression, I mean, everybody needed a job. But he said that these guys, they hired them because they were good with their iron, their pistol, their cuerta, which is a gun. And so basically he said that that was a prerequisite on that ranch, that they had to be able to handle themselves with a pistol. And I said, well, was it because of the thieving? And he's like, no, it's because of those wolves, fool. I'm like, well, you know, it happens. There's cattle thieves too, you know, and he goes, no, that wasn't the problem. It was those wolves that you want to know about. And I was like, okay. And so he tells me that they found a hole near a creek, near a dried creek bed. And it was this huge hole. And he said that it was big enough for people to go inside of it. And he said that after a couple of days that the vaqueros, a couple of them got the sand to go down in it. So they went down in this tunnel and never came back. And he said that it scared the pants off of the other guys that were still there, you know, working, whatever. And they went back to the main ranch and they told Amos that some of the guys had gone missing. Now, he tells me that there were 3, but then Abel later told me there was only 2. I don't know. The number doesn't really matter. Let's say 2 or 3 had gone missing in this tunnel. So the old man that ran the ranch, that owned it at that time, he told them to bury it, to cover it over. Now, I don't know what kind of equipment they use. This is in the 30s. I'm doubting that they had any kind of real excavation equipment. So I guess they just took a bunch of guys and shoveled dirt into it and covered it up. But he said that they buried it pretty heavily. And so I guess that was considered like an act of like war, I guess, to these things. So this is what really started it. This is what set it off. You know, this is what started the whole problem, according to Noah. That was the jumping off point to him, the beginning. Now, I'm sure there were problems before, but I guess these older guys that I was talking to, I guess they don't know about those problems. All they know is that that was what they were told, that that's how it started. Well, the next night after it was buried, the bunkhouse that sat on the southwest corner of the property got attacked. And the first night, they said it was just rocks. Now, he told me that where that bunkhouse used to be, there's still some pieces of it, that these rocks, he said that as a grown man, if you pick one of them up, you might be able to throw them a couple feet with both arms over your head. But he said that they were flinging them at the bunkhouse and they were knocking big holes in the wall and everything. And so the next night, I guess this went on throughout the night. The next day, they were trying to fix it, whatever. Well, it didn't matter because they got attacked again the second night. And that's when supposedly a big shootout took place. And a couple of the guys shot themselves, like shot each other. And back then, there was no electricity in Texas until like 1951. So they used lanterns, kerosene lanterns. And so the bunkhouse caught fire and it burned down. And one of these guys got drugged out into the woods. And that was it. They never found the guy. We don't know what happened to the guy. These were guys from Mexico. Like I said, it was during the Depression. Who knows? Well, all the guys left. All but like 4 of the dudes left. There were 2 guys from Mexico that stayed and 2 of the white guys that stayed. The rest all either left to go back to Mexico or they left where they came from. Well, one of the guys that left absconded with, or eloped, I guess I should say, with Gladys, who happened to be, I guess, their dad's sister. So they left. Now, during the Depression, it's hard to find a job. You get a job. Something really bad had to really happen for you to leave, to just quit that job. You know, you had room and board and pay. So, yeah, something terrible had to have happened. So all but 4 guys had left, and then they rebuilt another bunkhouse closer to the main house, and they hired some more guys. And so that was the beginning. And so what Noah said was they started having problems big time after that initial battle took place. I guess you want to call it a battle. They started taking the cattle, like not one here and there. No, it was like that. He said that, now he says it was in 2 months. Abel said it was 3 months. And like I said, there's these little differences between the numbers or whatever, but within a 2 or 3 month span, 400 head of cattle were killed. I don't even know how to wrap my mind around. That's a lot. I mean, he said that they had about 400 cows out there, steer, whatever, and that they were obliterated, and that this went on, and they killed all the chickens, they killed all the hogs. It was just ridiculous what these things are capable of doing if they're mad. They're like an angry hive of bees. And so it all culminated with, and I think I talked about her in the last time I was on. Her name was Myrtle. She was a little kid back then. But one of these things, and according to Noah, it was a small one. Now, I don't know why he knows that or how he knows that. I didn't ask that. But he said that he goes, one of the smaller ones, there was a giant tree that was outside of the window that Myrtle slept in, and it crawled up that tree, and it yanked her out the window. And he said that it was dragging her across the yard, and that these vaqueros that were out there closing up, they saw it, heard it, whatever, came running and started shooting. And luckily they didn't hit her, and the grandfather was freaking out. But once it dropped her, they all opened up on it, and it fled. It got away. And according to what Art Jr., who I guess no one knows very well, told him that the woods, well, he was a little boy, a little bitty kid or whatever, and he said that he saw the woods full of eyes. That's a creepy story. And he said that who knows what would have happened. So that traumatized her for years. I mean, I guess that was one of the things that made her never go out at night and whatever. This went on. They were desperate. They tried bringing in some hunters, a guy that claimed that he'd bagged the big 5 in Africa. And I've been to Africa. I've been there, and I've seen a few of these species. And let me tell you, dude, they're pretty awesome creatures. But I don't see them stacking up to one of these things. And so when they went into the woods, long story short, they came back after seeing what they were up against, told them no thank you, you're on your own, and left. That was the end of that. So that didn't work out. Him and his guys, they're like, there's no way I'm going to hunt these things. So they took off. Apparently they saw them. So what they ended up doing was they burned down the woods around it. They had no other choice. It was either that or, I guess, basically just throw in the towel and they all leave. So Amos's wife said, if we don't leave, I'm going to leave you. She was going to take the kids and take off. So I guess this was a last-ditch effort to try to save what was left, or at least remove them from the property, because at this point, the only people that were there out of loyalty. One of them was Adam Sr., which was Noah's dad. And so they burned the woods. And now he said that his dad talked about that part, that they had to burn the woods to get rid of these things. And they moved the tree line back a long ways. And he said that after a couple days, they came back after this fire that they had started had petered out. But when they came back, he said it was like another planet. All the woods were singed to ash, and they just had an empty bunch of buildings with nothing. It was like nothing. And so Amos decided then and there that he was going to sell it. And I asked him what his dad had ever told him. He said there wasn't anything else his dad had really ever told him. He goes, most of the information I got was from his brother, Lupe. And he said that his brother was one of the 2 vaqueros that stayed. But I guess it paid off because they ended up buying that property for like next to nothing. And during all this, they had a sister, and she eloped with one of the cowboys after the whole thing with the girl being drug out. That was it for them. He stuck it out longer than most, but he, I guess, was from like Montana, somewhere near Butte or something. And so he took off with Gladys, which was Adam's younger sister. She worked kind of as a housekeeper. She lived inside the main house with the kids and stuff. She left, and they never heard from her again. And when Adam Jr., Noah's older brother, died just back in November, they tried to locate anything about her because her name was on one of the deeds, I guess. She was part of, she was the last of that generation or whatever. And I was thinking, wow, there's no way she's still alive, but they were thinking maybe she had a descendant or something. I don't know the whole story about how that works. So anyway, nobody ever heard from her again, and don't blame her. She probably never wanted to set foot on that place again. So the land was partitioned off, I guess, 2 different tracts. And then there was another piece to the other side that Amos auctioned off or whatever. And so they ended up with just this middle strip now. And so they got neighbors that live further north, and then they got neighbors that live further south, to the west, southwest. And that's Adam and his sons, which are Noah and Abel. And so Noah told me that by the time he was born, the big house, their ancestral home that Abel now occupies, it had been there for several years. But when they were building it, according to what his mother told him and his uncle, when they were building it, these things continued to harass the family, and that they had to hire 3 different crews. And that one of the guys from the first crew, which were, I guess, essentially like friends or something, actually, he got drug out of his tent. They had like a tent that they were sleeping in or whatever, I guess, early on in the construction of this thing. And he got drug out of his tent and bit and got his thigh tore up real bad, and he almost died. So he would get a group of guys to help, and then they would leave, and then he'd try to get another group of guys. And so it ended up costing more to build the house than it did to buy the property, if you can believe that. That's crazy. So these things were determined to not allow them to come back and take root. But they did. Humans are stubborn. So they rebuilt, and he started out with some sheep, and then he bought cattle, and then he just worked his way back up, and he rebuilt the farm. And Amos, his son, they didn't come back for a while. But then eventually Art Sr., he took over. He came back and started ranching again, and he started rebuilding. But all the time, they would lose cattle, and they would find these weird, what they call markers, like deer heads up in trees. And sometimes they would have a steer that would get slaughtered, and they would stab the head onto one of the fence posts. I don't know if it was like a marker or a warning. I don't know what that was or what that is. That's weird. But anyway, I got into Noah's encounter. He said he encountered them 3 times. And when you think about it, him being in his 70s, that's not a lot for a 70-year life out there. That's not a whole lot. So it's not like they're just walking outside and they're just right there ready to pounce. They're there on the property. And he said that one time when he was a little boy, he said he was 8. I think he said he was 8 or 9. I can't remember which. But he said that he was playing down by this creek. And he said that creek that they would play at would sometimes have water, sometimes it wouldn't. And that there was a big mound right there by the creek. And he, in his estimation, he thinks that that's where the hole was, that that's where they covered it up. But he was told never to go down there. And him and his older brothers were down there playing in that creek. And these 3 dogmen, which he doesn't call them dogmen, these 3 wolves, walked out of the woods. And he said that they walked out of the woods and they were off to their left of them. But he said that they never took their eyes off of them, and all the boys, it was them and some neighbor boys from the neighboring property. They all just stopped playing and just stared at these things, and these things stared at them. And he said that they all got down on all 4s and began to lap water from the creek. And they all just kind of stared at him the whole time. And he said that the funny thing was, he's like, I heard this popping noise. And he said that was the first time he'd ever heard that noise or whatever. But he said that when they get down on all 4s, he said they make a popping noise. Now, Abel added to that later when I talked to him. He said that when they move up and down, they make this popping noise. And I asked Noah to describe it, and he says if you take like a plastic soda bottle, you pop the cap off, he's like, that's almost how it sounds, but like in quick succession, pop, pop, pop. That's the image I got in my mind. And he said he heard it, and he was like, what is that? Like, that is, was so weird, and he's like, I knew these things existed. I had heard lots of stories about it, and we knew we weren't supposed to be over there in that part of the property, but the creek was so inviting. It was summertime, or he said it was late spring, actually. He didn't say summer, but he said that it was inviting. And he said, and in the summertime, it's very inviting, and if it's hot. So when they walked back into the woods, He said that all the boys ran back to the house. And he said that when he got back to the house, his dad gave them a whooping. He basically whipped him pretty good. And he really got on to Adam because he's the oldest and he was supposed to be watching the younger ones and should have known better than to take them down there. His dad told him, don't ever go down to that part of the property because these wolves live over there. And he's like, you're lucky to be alive. And he began to get the impression that it wasn't a big deal. Like, what is the big deal? These things aren't hurting us or anything. But his dad had a healthy fear and respect and hatred for these things. He hated them. He didn't like them at all. And so he told them, he goes, these things are bad news. They're really bad. Don't mess with them. Don't let them see you even. If you see one, hide. So that's Noah's story. That's what he told me. It was just contrasting his story to Abel's story. And I'm going to get into Abel's story. What he told me about Abel's story was pretty crazy. He said that you can talk to my brother and you can get more information from him than what I can tell you because he actually caught one of these things. So he kind of left me with that. And like I said, his other two encounters, I'll get into those a little bit later. I'll go back to it, but he left me hanging with that. And so we talked a little more, but it wasn't anything about Dogman. It was about building hot rods and going to a brothel in Austin in the 60s. It was crazy. A bunch of crazy nonsense. So I ended up going, yeah, okay, and it was very polite, and we talked, and we got off the phone. A couple days later, I get in touch with Abel. It was a Sunday. He just got out of church. He's a deacon at his church. He's a real religious guy. He doesn't drink or do any of those things. I guess he used to at one point. He was drinking at one point and smoking cigars every day, and his house caught fire. So I'll tell you about that. But anyways, talk to Abel. And of course I wanted to know everything I could about this dog man that he supposedly caught. Well, he started from the beginning too, and he basically just reiterated everything that Noah had told me going back to the beginning with the hole that they covered up, and he talked, and of course the numbers were a little different, it wasn't exact and identical, but it was basically the same thing. I got the gist of the same story. But when I got to the part about his encounters, he goes, dude, I've encountered these things over and over again. And then he said every day for several months I encountered one. And I'm like, how is that? And he says, because I caught one. Now that's what I wanted to know. And so I told him, I said, can you tell me about this? And he says, yeah, oh, yeah.
Well, that's going to do it for part 1 of this interview with Josh Turner. To catch part 2, we'll catch you back here next Friday night at 9 Eastern. As always, thanks so much for listening. Have a great night.